looks like the government will get support for its new bill on industrial relations. It says, "We'll get wages moving." The key is in the title of the bill, in fact. Joining me now is Government Services and NDIS Minister Bill Shorten, who knows a thing or two about industrial relations with his background. Thanks for your time.
No worries, Tom.
So it's about getting wages moving. What does that mean exactly? The current projection is 3.75% by the middle of next year, the wage price index, the same the following year, and then 3.25 the year after that. So what increase are we talking? How much will that number be nudged up?
I don't think I can put a number on it, but I do know that the current wages system in Australia has been broken. It's been broken for some years. The normal way that people can negotiate wages increases is either change your job, but if you don't have that option, it's through the award system, the increase in the minimum rates, or enterprise bargaining. And the problem is that for minimum rates, there hasn't been a lot of movement, and we've made it put in place, or we think, a fairer system for that. And also, the enterprise bargaining system's been going backwards. That's the main driver where you deliver productivity and you deliver wages improvements, but really the system's been atrophying for 10 years.
Individual agreements have increased, and the outcomes on those seem pretty good. Is this just a fact that fewer people join unions and more people just prefer to negotiate by themselves, and maybe that's not a bad thing?
I love this sort of unicorn fairy tale land where low-paid workers are just able to go and negotiate wages on their own. Individuals are smart, I've always thought that, but where you lack bargaining power, how does an individual working in a factory or working in a cleaning company or working in a transport yard just go and negotiate equally with an employer who's got their lawyer, got their accountant? Whereas if there's better collective bargaining, it levels the playing field so that a group of truck drivers can go in, or a group of cleaners can go in, or a group of security guards, or a group of people working in the private sector and childcare can go and at least collectively negotiate.
So, I mean, I guess a lot of the individual agreements are usually rung up from that pay, broadly speaking. But even so, when you talk about all these people, get in a group, that's the way you negotiate. If people thought that, they'd be joining their union. But union rates are low and getting lower, particularly in the private sector.
Well, that's a matter for unions to sort out, but
you're
the law
part of the union movement. Why do you think people aren't joining unions?
Well, first and foremost, I'm a Cabinet Minister in the Albanese government, so my job's to represent all Australians. But one of the dilemmas in our wages system is that it has been easy for employers to go to their workers who are on a union agreement and say, either you take a pay cut or I'll just terminate the agreement and put you back on the award. It's been too easy. And for a lot of workers in feminised industries and low-paid industries, the statistics don't tell lies. They just haven't been able to bargain.
So if you improve the ability for unions to bargain, people will join them. Is that the basic?
Well, no. If
premise?
you improve the ability for people to bargain collectively, then they'll get some modest wage improvements.
What about strikes? Will strikes increase?
I don't see why that would be the case.
There is a greater ability to strike, though.
There's no doubt that the previous government's taken away the ability of people to withdraw their labour. But just, again, let's talk about some of the fairy tales that the Dutton neocon right have been spinning in this industrial relations debate, where they say that every person working in a milk bar or a hairdressing salon in your Westfield shopping centre will be signed up to the CFME. They're just making it up. For a worker to withdraw their labour and not get paid, it's a big step. It's a last resort. And so I don't see a lot of that changing. But what I do see, and this is where for people watching the show and for people just making ends meet in the current economic climate, is that in feminised industries, there's going to be more pay equity cases. There'll be more recourse to some arbitration if the employer won't bargain at all. So I think it will have a modest improvement, but I'm not going to overstate the impact.
Okay.
But I certainly wouldn't join this sort of overheated, pearl-clutching, chin-stroking right-wing debate which says somehow Tom Connell will be forced to join the CFMEU. I just don't think that's going to happen, Tom.
It'd be a weird union for me to join as well, apart from anything else.
Oh, well, you never know. You've got hidden potential as a negotiator, I'm sure, but maybe. I don't think it's going to happen.
Maybe. But when you say that's a scare campaign, is it something to keep an eye on? If we see overall industrial action increasing, is that what Labor's doing, keeping an eye on this bill? And if it has an unintended consequence, then you'd look to make changes?
I just want to say to people in Australia, I wouldn't go to sleep tonight worrying that the childcare workers of Australia will all be out on strike next Tuesday. I wouldn't start worrying that there'll be no trucks on the roads. I wouldn't start worrying that security guards will all of a sudden not be doing security guard work. So I do think a lot of the debate's overheated, actually.
But if that does happen, I mean, childcare is a great example. A lot of parents would say, well, if that happens, I'm stuffed. If we see that outbreak...
Let's talk about the 10 things keeping parents sending childcare up at nights. I don't think it's that their workers not going to work. I think, does the childcare centre able to attract enough workers? Can they afford childcare, which is more likely they can under our changes that we've just made? They're worried about other issues. You know, this is...
Well, that's because no one's taking industrial action now, but this might make that more possible. I'm just saying, are you open to keeping an eye on this? Because if there is that sort of disruption...
The government will... I'm just not going to sustain a sort of fear campaign with no visible means of support, Tom.
Okay.
That's the problems in Australia. Do we have enough skilled workers? Is our infrastructure working? Is our education system fit for purpose? Are people getting apprenticeships? Are people on disabilities getting a fair deal? Like the argument that somehow we're going to see a whole lot of Southern Cross flag waving childcare, early childhood educators just marching up and down the streets in front of Parliament every day. It's just not a problem.
If they do get more pay, is it the parents that ultimately will pay for the pay increase?
I think this is an age-old debate. If a worker gets paid more, is that an economic crisis? I think the bigger problem at the moment isn't that childcare workers might get an extra $1 or $2 an hour. I think the problem is that they're not keeping up with electricity prices, energy prices. We've got inflation in the system. No one's arguing for double-digit pay rises, okay? So let's not exaggerate that. What we need, though, as we approach Christmas is that you've got people who, with inflation running at 7.5%, 8%, they're effectively, with no wage rise, getting a 7.5%, 8% cut. If working people in this country don't have some money in the pocket to spend, the people who suffer are the retailers. The whole economy just goes into a spiral of decline.
I mean, I don't think the zero is not the average, but the gap is still there, obviously, at the moment of 3 or 4%. I want to talk NDIS as well. There's a review going on and a sustainability concern that's been spoken about. Your promise before the election, no plan would go backwards. Is that?
No, I said there'd be no more unfair cuts. And we want to work towards achieving no more unfair cuts. What was happening before the election?
So some plans will go backwards to make it sustainable?
Well, no, I reckon that let's just back up several steps before we get to that conclusion. There's a challenge in the scheme to make sure that the scheme's getting value for money. There's no doubt there's fraud, and I do not understand why the previous government was asleep at the wheel. There's no doubt that we need to be better at regulating the payments, making sure that the invoice that's put in for a service actually happened, or it happened to the purpose that it was the invoice states. I also think that we've got to make sure that we start paying on outcomes rather than just volume of services. But I must also say that when we talk about the costs of the scheme, people with disability, the NDIS is working well for a lot of people, and that we never have a discussion about the benefits. So in a discussion about costs, we need to talk about discussion about benefits.
Just on benefits. And I understand on one level the benefits to human beings living their life. I completely understand that.
No, that's very good of you.
Well, I'm just saying, because my next comment is going to the hard dollars on it. Because the original plan was spoken about every dollar invested would get back $2.25 in terms of economic activity and so on. Is that happening? Is it being measured? What do we know about
that? Well, I think we could do better at measuring the benefits.
Do we know what that measuring is now?
We do know what some measures of benefits are. The quarterly report, most recently one issued, talks about more, for example, carers of people with disability are re-entering the workforce than before the scheme. We know that parents with kids with disabilities who've had the early intervention support of NDIS are doing better at school. We know that participants in the scheme are experiencing better quality of life. So we do measure that. I'd like to put more rigour into measuring the benefits.
Do we have anything that gets that simple dollar in, dollar out?
Well, the Per Capita Institute did some work before the election for National Disability Service providers. It said for every dollar being spent on the scheme, there's a $2.25 in economic activity. But I'd like to drill into that more and make sure we...
Economic activity is different to benefit, though, isn't it?
Well, if you get a job out of the scheme, that's a benefit. If you've got someone who's out and about and not sitting at home, isolated and neglected, that's a benefit. For me, what's important is taking the red tape out of the scheme for both service providers and participants, making sure decisions are made transparently. But I want to crack down on people who are overcharging. I want to crack down on invoices being submitted without an ABN or without making sure that the work's real.
All right. Well, that will make a difference. There's still a big sustainability question overall, but I know that's being looked into. I'm sure we'll talk.
And there's a benefit too.
Yes.
That's
all. All right, Minister, thank you for your time today.
Lovely to catch up.